Namaste everyone, welcome to today's presentation. This is on the Bhagavata Purana and Vedanta. So let's look at the context of the Bhagavata Purana. Uh, for example, in the Mahabharata, Krishna just appears. There's no real background story about his childhood or anything like that. The Harivamsha is the first text that has some backstories. And it is a Bhagavata Purana that completes all these backstories by describing the birth of Krishna, his growing up, and so on. Canto 10 in the Bhagavata Purana is the most famous of all, but all the other cantos have deep theology, cosmology, and so on. So, of course, Canto 10, because it's all about the famous, all the stories, is why it's the most famous. The Bhagavata Purana emphasizes the typical Shravanam, Mananam, Nididhyasanam, which is hearing, assimilation, meditation, which can then help one focus on God. It also stresses the importance of Saptaha, which is basically you can view it as a gathering where the stories are narrated. And it's a mixture of vernacular to connect to the audience. So it could be in English, for example, or it could be in Marathi, Hindi, Tamil. And of course, it makes references to the Sanskrit slokas effectively to say that, look, these things, although being discussed in the vernacular, are derived from the scripture. If you look at the Bhagavata Purana, it's predominantly a bhakti oriented text because the focus is on devotion to God. So let's look at some of the structure that the Bhagavata Purana uses. So the first is that it brings calamity. It uses calamity as the main item to bring people to God. So the whole context of the Mahabharata and the Bhagavata Purana is Parikshit who is cursed to die in 7 days. So, so that calamity brings him to God. The other one is the story of Gajendra, which is the elephant who was caught in a crocodile's mouth. And again, Gajendra asks his friends and family to help, but when nobody comes forward because they are afraid of the crocodile, then Gajendra turns to God. Similarly, the story of Chitraketu, where he wants a son, and once he gets a son, he's sort of very much attached to his son and so on. In fact, he ignores his wives and things which leads to the death of his son. And then when his son dies, suddenly that opens his eyes that he needs to be closer to God. So this is a sort of ongoing theme in the Bhagavata Purana where it says calamity brings people closer to God. It also has a lot of repetition and nested stories. For example, Shaunaka speaks to the sages, and he refers to some previous dialogue. Similarly, Shuka and Parikshit, and Shuka says he heard it from Vyasa. Vyasa says it was told by Narada, and so on. So this is a very, very common structure in the Bhagavata Purana. Most stories have this nested structure. They refer to past stories and so on. The idea is that the Bhagavata Purana wants to emphasize that time is cyclic. Of course, each of our lives is linear, but this linearity repeats infinitely with slight variation. So the whole idea is that time is a cycle, and that's again keeping with the idea of samsara, where everything is a cycle of birth and death and so on. Moksha, the Bhagavata Purana again has a lot of emphasis on moksha because ultimately bhakti should lead to moksha. And so emotions, good or bad, can lead to moksha is the emphasis in the Bhagavata Purana. Again, that's because of the notion of connecting to God. So, for example, Hiranyakashipu was thinking of Vishnu all the time. So that is why, although he hated Vishnu, he got moksha. So that's what I'm saying by saying emotions good or bad, because he was connected to Vishnu. Prahlad, on the other hand, was not afraid to speak his mind. He was a great devotee of Vishnu, so that gave him moksha. Dhruva initially desired just to be on his father's lap and so on, very worldly desires. But then once he started meditating, it led him to something much, much bigger. Those material desires were not really important. So again, it is the emotions that once he was meditating that led him to connect with Vishnu and get moksha. The Bhagavata Purana also says that, look, the people may be very devoted, but strange are the ways of life. It's very hard to explain all this. So, for example, Parikshit was cursed to die for a very small mistake. He garlanded a sage with a snake, and the sage's son cursed him to die, which, in the context of various things that have happened, it's a relatively small mistake. Similarly, Chitraketu's son had to die for him to become spiritual, right? I mean, uh, why should somebody else die for someone to become spiritual? But that's just what it Bhagavata Purana says. It's very hard to explain all this, what is happening. Ultimately, it just says Krishna or Vishnu can bestow moksha. So if you show bhakti, true devotion, you will get moksha. So that's the main uh, essence behind the Bhagavata Purana. But having said that, in this talk, I want to point out that there are Vedantic elements in the Bhagavata Purana. For example, the Supreme is referred to as Sat from Sat Chitananda. There is also a notion of pure consciousness, which is Chit, and it talks about what is present in the Drigdisha Vivekam as a pure Sakshi or a pure witness and not a object and so on. Brahman is equated with Ishvara, Bhagavan, Paramatma, although technically, there are subtle differences between Ishvara, Bhagavan, and so on. But at a very, very high level, the Bhagavata Purana says they're all the same. Brahma is also equated to Purusha, so it doesn't want to negate Samkhya. So it says, look, these kind of philosophical discussions are not very relevant, so let's not worry about that. So Brahman can be Purusha also. It also has a debate between Nirguna and Saguna Brahman. Nirguna Brahman is more abstract because the Brahman does not have any properties and it is not related to in the sense of practice in terms of worship or whatever. But the Saguna Brahman is easier to characterize and hence worship. So most of the worship that happens, for example, in one's house or in one's temples, etc., is representing Brahman in some concrete finite form, but it is still the ultimate, but we have characterization, so it's easier to relate to. We can visualize it, we can imagine things, but Nirguna is much more abstract, so that is why it is not that popular or not easy for many people to relate. So the Bhagavata Purana again says, look, let's not worry about is it Nirguna, Saguna, etc. Those are interesting philosophical characterizations. But from a bhakti perspective, it is not, or connecting to God perspective, it is not that important. So the overview of the Bhagavata Purana, if you take the Gaudiya Vaishnavism interpretation, is that Brahman is both dual and non-dual. So it doesn't want to get into this Nirguna Saguna distinction. It also has the Achintya Bheda Bheda thing that this duality, non-duality is actually not conceivable, not describable. So let's not waste our time discussing these things. Creatures are part of God, so creatures obviously cannot be God, they're part of God, but God is not different from them. So that is where the sort of difference and non-difference, etc., is hard to explain. But it admits that everything depends on Brahman, and this Brahman can be called Krishna, called Bhagavan, etc. And again, the focus on in the Bhagavata Purana is on ashraya or refuge to everybody. So anybody who connects with Krishna or Vishnu or Bhagavan will get sort of refuge from Brahman, Krishna, whoever you refer to. So the structure of my presentation is I'll just talk about the key ideas. There are references to verses, but I will not reproduce them. People can look them up in the citation that I'll provide at the end. The aim here is to understand the links to Vedanta. As I said, Bhagavata Purana is well understood to be a bhakti text. So that itself is very well understood. But of course, it links bhakti to jnana and vairagya. So, and it talks about that jnana and vairagya are stepping stones to true bhakti. So that is why this Advaitic interpretation or Vedantic interpretation is not exactly the same as Shankara's Advaita. For Shankara, jnana is the ultimate, while bhakti and karma, yoga, etc., are stepping stones. So, so vairagya is again detachment, but I mean, so again, you can do action by suitable detachment, but they are all stepping stones. Jnana is the ultimate. Bhagavata Purana, throughout its text, is very, very consistent. It talks about personal connection. So, as I said, the personal connection can be positive or negative, like Hiranyakashipu was negative and Prahalad was positive. So, as I said, I will refer to verses, but I will not reproduce them here. So, if you look at Canto 1, Chapter 1, Verse 2, that's 1.1.2, it says, look beyond material benefits. It refers to Vedic rituals, but it points out that these Vedic rituals are for personal gain, such as going to heaven. So, essentially, you are trying to please the Vedic gods, Indra, Varuna, etc., for going to heaven. But it points out that staying in heaven is temporary because positive karma eventually will run out and then you're back to samsara. So, yes, doing these Vedic rituals has a positive effect because you can enjoy heaven, but it's not permanent. So, it's not moksha in that sense. Similarly, verse 2.9.1 talks about the Atman, the body, and the dream, which are all basically ideas from the Mandukya Upanishad, where you can talk about being in the waking state, dream state, and deep sleep state, but none of them are moksha. Moksha is something permanent and beyond these three states. Uh, Verse 4.7.52 talks about only one supreme, calls it Kevala, the exact only one, and everyone's Atman is related to the supreme. Um, Again, because this notion of relation can be quite complicated, is like Shankara says, or in Advaita, it says that everyone's Atman is identical to Brahman. But here, it doesn't want to get into those philosophical discussions. It actually says it's all related. I mean, like in Ramanuja's case, which is Vishishta Advaita, it says, look, it's a part of and the supreme and so on. So again, it doesn't want to sort of get into these philosophical debates because it aims to connect to everybody. Verse 4.7.54 is very interesting. It says Shiva, Brahma, Vishnu are all the same. So basically, they're all Brahman. So Krishna is also Brahman. And it further points out that viewing Shiva as separate from Krishna will not attain moksha. So while Bhagavata Purana is viewed predominantly as a Vaishnava text because it is all about Krishna and Vishnu and so on, it makes it very clear that you should not view Shiva as separate from Krishna. So all the stories of Shiva, etc., can be in principle included, but because ultimately Shiva is Brahman and Krishna is also Brahman. So this separation that it's a Vaishnavite text and does not cover other gods is strictly not true. Verse 5.11.13 is very, very similar to verse 9.10 in the Bhagavad Gita. It says Brahman is all pervading, Brahman is never born, it never has, mainly it's eternal, and it's again repeated in Canto 12. chapter 5. Um, Verse 10.3.13 says Brahman is Swaprakasha, that is self-illuminating, and so on. So again, these are all very Vedantic terms. You will very rarely find Swaprakasha and things in pure Bhakti texts. So that is why the strong evidence that the Bhagavata Purana is not purely a Bhakti text, although it is known or it's famous for Bhakti. 11.3.38 links Brahman as pure knower. So again, references to the Bhagavad Gita, the knower of the field versus the field itself. So Kshetra versus Kshetrajna. So these things are again emphasized in these verses. So I want to point out in two specific verses in Canto 8. It says Brahman causes the universe to move but does not move. The reason is Brahman is there everywhere. So you can only move if you can go from one place to the other, right? You can say, I'm going from, my current position in the chair to the living room, only because I'm not in the living room. But if you're there everywhere, then, what does move make? It makes no sense. So that is why Brahman causes the universe to move. So all of us are moving because of Brahman, but Brahman does not move itself. And this is related to the Ishavasya Upanishad, where Brahman is sitting but faster than anyone, because Brahman is just sitting, but if I want to go from point A to B, Brahman is already in B. So that's in that sense, it is faster than anyone. So ultimately, it says if it's there everywhere, there's no need to move to reach a destination. Therefore, it's in some sense faster. Uh, the Bhagavata Purana also talks about God being all-knowing, but cannot be known. Again, going back to the Vedantic idea that this is pure subject and cannot be an object. And this is, that is Bhagavan, Krishna, what Brahman can only be realized. And this matches up exactly what is explained in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. So again, there are a lot of these Vedantic references. So let's look at the story of Parikshit. So in Canto 12, chapter 6, verse 5, Parikshit finally, after listening to everything, says, understanding the Atman is key to not fearing death. So again, it says that is what is moksha, right? That you attain immortality because you understand the Atman, you realize that one's true self is the Atman, so then there is no notion of death. The body dies, of course, but not the one's true self. So there's this notion of then dependent existence. So the body cannot live without the Atman. So the Atman determines everything. So everything depends on the Atman. But the Atman itself is independent of everything else. So this again, it gives the analogy of fire and fuel. So you cannot have a fire without a fuel, but a fuel sort of can exist without a fire. So the fire is dependent on the fuel to exist. Um, so verses 12 in Canto 12 in chapter 13, 15 and 19, it says Bhagavata Purana is nothing but Vedanta. If you read those verses, it's obvious. It says meditate on Sat. So Sat is of course the truth or Brahman. So it says that is the source of the Bhagavata Purana. So even the Bhagavata Purana has emerged from Brahman, which in some sense is not surprising because ultimately everything is dependent on Brahman. So including the Bhagavata Purana, everything is dependent on Brahman. So this concludes my very, very brief journey into Bhagavata Purana and Vedanta. I strongly recommend people to read the book by Dan Sheridan, the Advaitic Theism of the Bhagavata Purana. The book is actually available. And also the excellent book by Doctors Gupta and Valpe on the Bhagavad. They are editors. They have collected lots of interesting papers on the Bhagavata Purana. And the other last URL is for the translations of the Sanskrit verses which I refer to. You can go there, you can see the Sanskrit and the verse and the translations and so on. So again, I hope in this very, very short presentation, I've been able to explain uh, at a very, very superficial level that the Bhagavata Purana, although known for its bhakti, has lots of Vedantic elements in it. I hope this has generated more interest in the Bhagavata Purana, especially from a Vedantic perspective. So thank you very much. Namaste.